Meeting of the Washington County Water Consortium. My name is Adriana. I'm a planner with Washington County's Public Health and Environment Department, and every month myself and my colleague from the Washington Conservation District, Angela, put together this monthly meeting to gather public and private partners to share ideas and information, lessons learned on any and all topics under the water resources umbrella. So we have three great speakers today, two joining us from St. Anthony Falls Laboratory and the U of M to talk about beavers, and then later a wetland specialist from the Board of Water and Soil Resources will share about updates to the Wetland Conservation Act. Before we get started this afternoon, as per usual, if you have any ideas for topics or have a presentation you'd like to share, please reach out to Angela or I. If you're interested in viewing past consortium topics, please go to the Washington County website and search the Water Consortium, and we have all the past topics and presentations and agendas there. Before we start the presentations, does anyone have any announcements to share? Okay, hearing none, we'll get started. So our first two speakers are Dr. Emily Fairfax, Assistant Professor of Geography with the University of Minnesota and affiliate faculty member with St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, and Andy Riesgraf, Research Scientist with the University of Minnesota and St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, and they will be sharing about beavers in Minnesota. And Emily will get it started. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. So I'm excited to talk to you all today about Minnesota's beavers, and especially thinking about the ways that we can balance the benefits that beavers potentially bring to us with the many conflicts that many of us are quite familiar with them also bringing. So I want to start off by just saying that beavers are nature's engineers. They get called this all the time. It's probably what they're best known for. And what you're looking at here is a pretty classic beaver dammed landscape in Minnesota. You can see we have a mixed forest in the background. There's pine trees, there's conifers, there's those deciduous hardwoods. It's all sort of blended together in the forest structure. We also have a lot of herbaceous vegetation. We have those weeds and reeds and shrubs that make up more of the valley bottom and that wetland environment. Now, right in the middle of this picture, we have a beaver dam, and you can see that water is spilling over it. Water is also going around it, it's going under it, it's going through it. These are leaky structures, and because of the way they're built, it gives you a variety of aquatic habitat types. There's riffles, there's runs, there's pools, there's margins, there's all sorts of complexity going on in this environment that beavers have engineered. Now, this is a pretty classic and picturesque beaver pond and beaver wetland, but a lot of our streams and a lot of the connectors between our lakes actually do not look like this today. Instead, they look a little bit more like this picture I popped up on the bottom left. They are simplified, narrow, oftentimes degraded streams connecting our lakes and going across the landscape, draining our watersheds. And in this narrowed and disconnected system, what you have is a lot less support for the riparian or creekside ecosystem. It doesn't have good connection to the water. It doesn't have good ways for that soil to develop. And so you start to lose this wetland fringe habitat. This is a pervasive problem here in Minnesota. We've lost approximately 50% of our historic wetlands, and many of those wetlands were located along the edges of our lakes, streams, and rivers. Now, this is a big challenge for us. Building wetlands is pretty hard. People can do it. There are wetland engineers that are people, but it is time consuming and it is expensive. And those are concerns for us humans, but they are not necessarily concerns for beavers. So beavers see a stream like this as an opportunity. They are going to move right in and start building their dams. Now, beaver dams, as I mentioned when I was describing the scene, these are leaky structures. They are absolutely slowing water down, but they're not stopping the water altogether. In doing so, they do create a pond, and that pond starts to reconnect valley bottoms and reconnect floodplains back to our surface water features like lakes and rivers and streams. You build back up what's called the riparian ecosystem, or that sort of fringe wetland habitat, and it starts to expand out and it starts to rebuild. This is one of the ways that beavers can work as an agent of restoration. Now, busy as a beaver is a phrase for a real reason. Beavers are absolutely not going to stop once they've built one dinky little dam. They want that dam to be bigger. They want it to be longer, they want it to be stronger, taller, hold back more water. For those of you that are not super familiar with beavers, this is a rodent that is semi-aquatic, meaning it lives in both water and on land. And an adult beaver will be weighing anywhere from 40 up to 110 pounds. Now, that 110 pounder, he came out of Wisconsin. He was the record breaker. Most beavers aren't getting quite that big, but finding an adult beaver that's 80 to 90 pounds is not uncommon. And I bring this up because beavers are basically an 80 to 90 pound chicken nugget for predators. When they go out on the landscape, they're very vulnerable. So all of this dam construction behavior, it's because the beavers want to feel safe. And the place that beavers feel safe is in the water. For every ounce awkward and poorly built they are for land, they are that many more ounces in control, agile, and protected in the water. They're outstanding swimmers holding their breath for 15 minutes. Basically, every predator fails to capture them if the beaver has water. So when the beaver sees the simple stream and it starts building and building and building, what it's doing is building safety for itself. But because beavers are an ecosystem engineer, they're fundamentally changing the structure of that landscape. They're having a lot of benefits and consequences for other creatures too. One of those benefits is they are continuing to expand our wetland habitat. And while dam building is easily the most dramatic and noticeable thing that beavers do, another behavior you may or may not have noticed is canal digging. So once those beavers build that big dam and they've got a nice big pond keeping them safe, eventually they do have to go out across the landscape to get food and building material that's further away. Now, instead of walking, or I should say waddling across the land, what they're going to do is they're going to dig canals. These are basically like little water highways that the beavers can swim through and reach farther away trees and building materials and then float that back to their home ponds. This basically makes your landscape look like a spider web of water. An enormous amount of hydrologic connectivity is built up by the beavers here. It's all to keep them safe. But the end consequence of this is that in a very short amount of time, we're talking like the span of 1 to 2 years, beavers can transform even the most simplified and degraded systems back into really healthy and robust wetland habitats. And if you were to visit one of these sites in the field, you would see something sort of like this. Now, to keep our terminology straight, we have the beaver dam on the left-hand side of your screen. That is the structure that they build that looks a lot like our dams. Its only purpose is to hold back water and to slow water down. This is separate from their lodge, which is the structure they live in. Common myth is that beavers live in the dam. They don't. They live in lodges or in bank dens. Now, the artist did a really good job here of showing beavers in the water looking super slick and in control and agile, beavers back on the land in the sort of background there looking round and chunky and eating their food and pretty vulnerable to predators. Typical beaver dammed landscape, what you're looking at here. And if I were to show you this, or if you were to visit one of these in the field, you would probably agree that, okay, beavers are nature's engineers, they've made a change here, but this change is relatively localized. It's a small problem. It's something that maybe affects one person's house or one person's yard. But what I want to show you is that this is a very, very small sliver of the engineering that beavers actually do. So right now, what you're watching is a video that I took on my drone where we have a couple of research assistants standing on top of a beaver's lodge, and we are zooming further and further away, just straight up into the air. And right about now, you will have been able to see 2 of the beaver's dams. Now, beaver is going to build anywhere from 2 up to 10 dams that it's going to be working all within its territory that is 1 to 2 kilometers of stream length long. Beavers have an incredibly outsized influence on the landscape. They are second only to humans in their ability to modify this continent. And as you can see in this now still zoom out of, this is Otter Creek up by Cloquet in Minnesota, beavers have a massive impact on water. Beavers have a massive impact on ecosystems. Beavers are incredibly dramatic in the ways that they change the land around us. And with that drama comes conflicts. So there's a lot that beavers are doing that we're noticing and that we can look at with awe and look at with, respect. It's a big change, but it can also be something that maybe gets in the way of our own priorities. Here in Minnesota, there's been a number of different concerns raised about beavers. There was a formal report that found that flooded roads, flooded agricultural fields, and timber were primary concerns. And then gnawing on people's sort of preferred trees and ornamental trees was another concern. I will also highlight that here in Minnesota, we will hear a lot of concerns about beavers and trout, and that this relationship is a little bit murky. So while it is completely true that beavers are cutting trees and they are flooding things, that is 100% innate beaver behavior, the relationship between beaver and trout is very data poor, especially in the Midwest. And despite the lack of information there, there has been pretty aggressive beaver management in the name of trout habitat. So I've put up a picture on this slide of a Interlochen Public Radio article that I really like that did a deep dive into the history of Minnesota beaver management. And it found that back in 2007, Minnesota DNR was pursuing a policy of beaver eradication on most streams draining into the North Shore that were also trout habitat. And this policy was pretty unpopular, actually, with Minnesota trappers. And it was pretty unpopular with a lot of people who were living up by the Knife River watershed and other watersheds up there because it felt like it was a step too far. Instead of sustainably managing beavers, you're eradicating beavers for another species. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and I will come back to that a little bit later in the talk. The point of this slide is really that we have conflicts with beavers. There are things that they're doing that we don't like them doing, and I just showed you how big their impact is. It's huge. So how do you manage an animal that is so profound in the ways that they shape the land? Well, if you look up the resources that we have on Minnesota DNR's website, I will give them absolute credit for saying they do show some methods for non-lethal management, which is great. However, some of these methods are a little bit outdated. So the Clemson pond leveler is recommended here and also used to be provided via a partnership program with prisons in the state where you could get them built for you. Unfortunately, the Clemson is no longer the recommended type of pond leveler, and Andy will talk a little bit more about that later. And also the prison program isn't running anymore. So it's hard to get pond levelers to deal with flooding. Wrapping fences around your trees is also a really good way to deal with tree damage. However, in this picture, the incorrect type of fence is shown. A beaver that's 80 pounds can easily crush down this fence, and it is also a little bit too close to the tree. So there is information. It could use some updating. There's also quite a bit of information about lethal management, which does reflect the primary management method currently in Minnesota. Most conflict situations are managed with lethal trapping. Here we have about 25,000 to 30,000 beavers trapped per year. Some of that is through recreational trapping, but the majority of it is through nuisance trapping or contract trapping for nuisance beavers. You can't move beavers in Minnesota, at least not right now. It's currently illegal. This is common in a variety of states, but also many states have changed their policies on beaver relocation in previous years, especially recent years. So I think there's some conversations to be had about if we need relocation in Minnesota or not. And then there's not a lot of financial support or other formal support for non-lethal and coex efforts. This is something that probably could use a little bit more attention here in Minnesota too. So I bring this up because beavers are really important. The title of my slide was Balancing Benefits with Conflict Management. So I want to be upfront. We have conflicts. We try to manage these conflicts. There are ways we could be managing them a little bit better. So I'll give you a sneak preview on a bit of this, and then I'll talk more about those benefits beavers provide, and then we'll pass it back to Andy to talk more about how we can make a big difference today managing our beavers. One thing I want to point out is that pond levelers, I mentioned the Clemson is no longer recommended. The Clemson pond leveler is a straight pipe pond leveler, fixed, usually made out of a PVC material. Now we install things called flexible pond levelers. And I won't get into the details of these, but what we're finding is that they're very durable. They're lasting 5 to 10 years with minimal maintenance, and they can last a lot longer if you take care of them. They're cheap, and they're ecologically integrated. You preserve the wetland while also mitigating flood damage. And unlike the Clemsons, these ones are a lot less vulnerable to ice damage and to plugging. We've also had a lot of really good scientific research done in just the past few years about tree protection. This study I really like came out of an urban area in Canada, and they did 4 different styles of tree guarding with fencing, including styles that are not recommended because we know the beavers can get through it. And even in the most poorly installed fences, the vast majority of trees were protected from beavers. I think sometimes beavers get this sort of myth about them as being completely like you cannot outsmart a beaver. And I will say they're very clever rodents, but we're also a very clever species, and we can outsmart them with pretty simple fences. Our neighbors next door in Wisconsin are working pretty hard on their non-lethal beaver management policies and practices too. There have been a number of higher profile pilots in the last couple of years where people are installing what are called beaver dam analogs even, or fake beaver dams in places where they really, really want this animal back. And also installing pond levelers to maintain that ecological balance where you get the benefits of a wetland without having the flooding or the other damages that you might be experiencing from the beaver being a little overzealous. This probably sounds like a lot of work to coexist with beavers. Like we don't usually think that much about coexisting with wildlife and putting in so much effort to keep an animal around. And I will say it is a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be a lot of work that you do yourself. So there are beaver management professionals that you can call. These are people who've had some sort of extensive training and know how to do all of this non-lethal management work, and also can help you figure out if it's something that would actually work on your property or not. Not every place is a good candidate for lethal management. Not every good place is a good candidate for non-lethal management. There's a lot of sort of site-specific considerations to be taken into account when you try to manage the animal that is second only to humans in modifying the physical earth. So why bother? You know, opened up by saying beavers are powerful, they're making these huge changes, and then led into the myriad of conflicts and things we have to think about if we want to keep beavers around. So why bother? Isn't it easier just to remove the beavers? I would argue, A, it's not easier just to remove the beavers. Beaver trapping is sort of a treadmill problem where you keep getting more and more beavers year after year after year because of the ways that the animal sort of disperses and moves through the landscape. But more than that, why bother is because beavers are not just an ecosystem engineer, they're also a keystone species. They're also one of the only animals that can build a wetland other than people. They're also one of the only animals that is directly providing benefits to us that help mitigate the damages of climate change. And so this is really what I've been researching for the last decade or so, is the ways that beavers are creating these wetland environments that are not just there today, but that are going to be able to resist disturbances like floods and droughts and fires going forwards. And we need to care about that. Here in the Great Lakes region, we are feeling climate change today. We have wetter and shorter winters. We're getting a lot more rain and not snow, especially on our shoulder seasons. The summers are drier, everything's hotter, and storms are much flashier. Now, I've got some alarming arrows on this slide showing 2.3 degrees of warming, 16 days longer of our frost-free season, 14% more total precip, and 35% more heavy precip events. And I want to point out, this is not the climate change that we think will happen. This is the climate change that we have already experienced in the last 50 years. We have already had this warming. We've already had this increase to our frost-free season. We're already getting the bigger storms. These are problems we're facing today, and these are problems we're going to keep facing tomorrow. And so with these, we're starting to see threats that we used to feel like were really a Western US problem. We're seeing wildfires. We're seeing really bad droughts. The number of red flag warnings that are being posted even in March, even in April here, are unprecedented. It is way drier, way hotter, and way more flammable than it used to be. And this is something where we have a pretty short window to figure out before it becomes a really pressing problem. So when I say why bother with beavers, the reason I think we need to bother with them is because the dams, canals, and wetlands they're building are some of our most climate resilient natural infrastructure that we can have. The complexity that beavers are building is where that resilience comes from, and it all starts with floods. So when you have a stream without beavers, like I'm showing you here on the left, and then you have that stream with beavers where they've increased the complexity, they've built the canals, they've connected the pond to the floodplain, they've connected upstream to downstream with all of their little pathways. It's a much more complicated system, and that really matters when you have a big storm or when you have a lot of snowmelt or where you have just a little bit too much water coming through your stream at a given time. In simplified streams, what happens is you get a flood wave. And so these flood waves, it's a lot of water coming through a really small area. You can imagine you turn on the garden hose and then put your thumb over most of it. Suddenly that water becomes a really destructive spray instead of a nice flow of water. That's what's happening in our streams. The flood waves come through, there's not enough space, and so they rip them absolutely to pieces. We see an enormous amount of erosion. We see absolute destabilization of the banks, and we see loss of vegetation and loss of habitat. And this wasn't the case historically, and it isn't the case today where we have these wetland patches, beaver created or otherwise. Flood waves will enter wider water, they'll enter deeper water, and the canals that beavers dig are nice little pipes basically to get that water out of the main channel, out onto the floodplain, where it encounters dense vegetation that can help slow the water down, get debris out of the water, and it does still go downstream. Remember, beavers do not stop water, they just slow it. But when it does go downstream, it's going down with a lot less power. It's going down a lot less destructively. And so instead of seeing that massive amount of erosion and soil loss and scouring, what you see instead is water being spread out, slowed down, and stored. And that stored water matters a lot. So now what I'm going to show you is the same thing, stream without beavers and stream with beavers, but we're looking with depth instead of at it from above. And so you can see the plants all along the top there, their roots are sticking down into the soil. We've got a relatively deep water table I've set here. This is common during summertime when it drops a bit. This is also pretty common on the North Shore and on some of our trout streams where we tend to have a deeper water table anyways. Now, our streams have a pretty narrow impact on soil water and groundwater when they're degraded, and our beaver ponds, which are much wider, have a much larger area of impact. I have put infiltrating precipitation on this top panel. So what that means is we've got rain in this image, and the plants don't care where the beavers are because they're getting watered from above. All the plants here are green. The plants in the stream without beavers are green. The plants in the stream with beavers are green. It's all green, it's fine. Beavers don't really matter during our wet periods when it's not a flood. Where they really do matter though is our dry periods. As soon as we take away that rain, as soon as we enter a period where there's not enough precipitation, plants rely heavily on soil water. And that soil water is really limited around our degraded streams. There's just not much. The water was moving through it too fast. It was in too small of an area. And so you don't really get the sort of earthen sponge that the plants can access water in. Opposite's true where the beavers are, because they're so good at slowing down the water during flood periods, because they get it out on the floodplain, because it has time to sink in the soil. You have this huge sponge of water that the beavers can just access. And this is something that I've seen in my own research. And it's also something that my colleagues have seen in the boreal wetlands of Canada, where even when you have multi-year droughts, the wetlands that beavers are building and maintaining do not experience that drought. They are protected from the drying, the plants stay green, the ecosystem stays intact. Because the beaver's number one order of business is to keep the water there. The water is their safety. So this is like having staff on hand 24/7, 365 to make sure that your freshwater resources are intact. Now, this drought resistance really matters when you have something that could start a fire. When you have a wildfire start, it is going to start burning whatever is dry. And when you have a wetland ecosystem or river ecosystem that is dried out because it's not drought resistant, like we're seeing in the stream without beavers, that fire can burn right up to the water's edge. It can burn right up to the river edge, right up to the lakeshore. And we've seen this in Minnesota, we've seen this in Wisconsin, we've seen this in many, many places. Where we don't see this happening is in beaver wetlands. And the reason for that is because the beaver wetlands never really experience drought. So the vegetation never really dries out. It never really gets easy to burn. This might feel like a bit of a stretch, like, okay, Emily, how did we get from beavers are cutting trees and building dams to beavers have prevented a wildfire from burning across the landscape? And I hear you, and I understand that sort of hesitation to believe that an 80-pound rodent can stop a wildfire. But I want you to think about this as a more intuitive and human process. If I was going to ask you to go get me stuff to start a campfire, and you came back with this just armful of wet leaves and fresh cut green branches, you know we're not starting a fire. You know we're not camping together again. That's not going to work. So there's this intuition that we have that when the vegetation is healthy, when it's green, when it's wet, it's not going to burn. All the beavers are doing is keeping things green and wet. And this isn't just a conceptual model either. This is something that I've seen over and over and over again in my research. So I have looked at dozens of wildfires across North America, including in Minnesota, including in Ontario. And in each of these wildfires, I see the same thing. We see catastrophic forest loss. We see stand replacing fires. We see devastation of the ecosystem. And then it approaches the beaver wetlands and it stops. So what you're seeing here is a forest that was burnt into totality at high severity, all the way up to the edge of the beaver wetland, which cuts through the center of this picture. And then the beaver wetland was too green, too moist, too wet to burn. And it didn't. It withstood a high severity fire. And in this case, it stopped the fire from going to the other side. So it truly did function as a fire break. Now, this is probably the most dramatic manifestation of beaver ecosystem engineering. And I know that fire is not the primary concern in most people's minds here. But if beavers can stop a fire, if they have so much strength to do this, then they have at least that much strength stopping the drought, because it's the drought resistance that makes the fire resistance. And if they have that much strength stopping a drought, they have at least that much strength stopping a flood, because it's the flood resistance that makes the drought resistance. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that beavers are really radically changing the way water moves through the landscape. And it protects us not just from one of these disasters. This isn't a choose one menu. They're all connected. If you want flood resistance, you get drought and fire resistance. If you want drought resistance, you get flood and fire resistance. And it's all just coming back kind of goofily to the fact that beavers feel awkward on land and they want to have water to survive. And if those kinds of things don't feel motivating to you, or maybe you know someone who's not motivated by disaster resilience somehow, and they're like, whatever, I can make it on my own, maybe dollar signs are a little bit more motivating. So there have been some really good studies that try to quantify the value of these ecosystem services that beavers are providing for us. And they come in a variety of forms. So there's recreational hunting and fishing. This can be for the beavers. It can also be for the abundance of trout, the abundance of waterfowl, the abundance of all sorts of other species that you find in those beaver wetlands. It comes in greenhouse gas sequestration. They're outstanding at sinking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and burying it in the floodplains where it is locked away and can help us mitigate some of that trajectory. It is also true for water supply. It's true for water purification. Beaver wetlands are uniquely capable of removing nitrates and phosphates from the water, which are common agricultural pollutants. It comes in the moderation of extreme events, which I sort of focused on here as it's the core of my research. It also comes in habitat and biodiversity provisioning and non-consumptive recreation. Maybe you think beavers are gross and you hate them, but you love to go birding. Then you probably actually love beaver wetlands because that's where all the birds like to hang out. And that's what's keeping those bird populations healthy and safe. When you add up all of this together, beavers are providing, on average, $179,000 worth of ecosystem services per square mile that they're engineering per year. So this is a continuous benefit they're providing to us. And in times where funding from other sources for things like disaster mitigation and water supply and purification are extraordinarily limited, having a natural engineer out there doing this work is huge. I used to work as an engineer. I know that some engineers can make $179,000 a year. Think of the savings. Instead of having to pay someone to do all of this, you just have to have a beaver, and all it wants is some sticks and to be left alone. This is really an untapped resource, especially here in Minnesota, where we have relatively healthy beaver populations. And I want to just highlight two of those ecosystem services in a little bit more detail and give you some studies that you can look at if you want to learn more. Water quality is a big one we worry about here in the upper Midwest. We've got a lot of things going on in the rivers and streams and lakes that are not ideal. Some of them are the things we can ignore, and some of them are the things we can't, like algal blooms. Luckily, beaver dams are, as I mentioned, really good at removing some really common pollutants from water. There's a really great study just came out this year on beavers and E. coli, and they found that although a lot of people imagine beavers as sort of gross and they think giardia and they think animal poop and they're like, ugh, the truth is that beaver dams and wetlands can remove about 95% of E. coli from the water. They're outstanding at removing this very common pollutant that if you maybe have had your dog go swimming and then come back and get a little bit sick, good chance that they have encountered a bit too much E. coli. Beaver wetlands are also uniquely capable of removing heavy metals from water. This is particularly common in places where we have mine drainage and mine contamination. There have been a couple of really good studies looking at mine drainage in Colorado and then mine drainage in Ohio and in the Ozarks, finding that lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, all of these really nasty toxic heavy metals will precipitate out in beaver wetlands and get buried and sequestered over time. And then, as I already mentioned, nitrates, phosphates, and those sort of more nutrient-style pollutants are equally heavily processed in the beaver wetlands through things like denitrification, where they turn it back into inert gas, but then also through phosphate removal as a burial process. So a lot of ways beavers are taking gross stuff out of the water, burying it in the pond, keeping it out of our realm of sight, and leaving us with healthier, cleaner, clearer water downstream. The other one that I just wanted to highlight for us here is biodiversity. This is incredibly important, and we have a lot of species here that rely on aquatic habitats, and our aquatic habitats are imperiled. There's a lot of things going on in them that make them harder for species to thrive. But beavers are keystone species, and beavers are really good at creating biodiversity hotspots. We see huge benefits measured in invertebrates, in birds, in mammals, in all sorts of other things, including in brook trout. Now, I have cited on here a study from the North Shore on Lake Superior that found that beavers and brook trout actually are good buddies, and they coexist quite well here in Minnesota under most conditions. So even if you don't like beavers, and I'm not going to pretend that everybody will, you probably like one of the species that relies on beavers. Somewhere between 50 and 80% of terrestrial species require access to a healthy riparian zone at some point in their life cycle, usually when they're breeding or little babies. And we don't have as much of that as we used to. So we really need to think about ways to conserve what we have and build up more going forwards into the future. So I'm hopeful that this has been motivating for everybody and you're like, all right, I'm ready to jump on the beaver train. What's next? And so when you think about next steps, one of the biggest things is living alongside beavers and coexisting with beavers. And that's where we've struggled the most. And that's where we have a lot of easy, low-hanging fruit room for improvement. So I'm going to pass it off to Andy, who's going to talk a little bit more about beaver management and coexistence. And then after Andy, we can take some questions from you all. So thanks for listening to me, and I will pass it to Andy now.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Can you see my screen? Are we presenting? All's good? Thanks, Emily, for the wonderful overview of beaver behavior and ecology and their ecosystem services. My name is Andy Riesgraff. In addition to being a U of M St. Anthony Falls Lab researcher, I've also completed the Beaver Institute's Beaver Core program. And what that is, it's a program that teaches you about beaver behavior, ecology, and how to build and install water control devices to resolve beaver dam flooding problems. So I'm just going to dive right into it. I'm going to talk about the most common human beaver conflicts and the latest methods that are used to foster coexistence. So the first one is trees, tree damage. Beavers chew and fell trees for three reasons. First, food. Beavers are vegetarians and they eat the inner bark of deciduous trees like willows, aspen, birch, alder, cottonwood, and others. The second reason is that they use the trees to build their dams and lodges. And then finally, um, the constant chewing that they do, it keeps their teeth sharp because, and also at the proper length because they're constantly growing. So what can we do when we are having tree problems or tree damage? Emily mentioned it briefly. Tree wrapping is one of the most common methods that we can do. And the goal of tree wrapping is to block access to certain trees. Maybe they're high value trees that are close to the water, or they're older mature trees. The goal is to not completely stop beavers from taking trees. The beavers do need to take trees, as I already mentioned. Um, and tree wrapping is relatively easy. It's relatively cheap. Oftentimes it's just can be a DIY project. Um, and what you're looking to do is wrap the trees with some heavy gauge wire fencing, 2 inch or 2 inch by 4 inch mesh, and you want to wrap it high enough to where the beavers are not able to reach. So that's about 4 feet. Do not use the lighter wire, the chicken wire, because that's just too flimsy. And like Emily said, these beavers can get up to, 80, 90 pounds. And then you want to leave a decent amount um, of space between the fence and the tree so that tree can grow and have space. And then securing that fence or that wrap securely to the ground with landscaping pins or posts is also recommended. Another thing you can do if, let's say, having a whole bunch of trees wrapped with fence and it might not be aesthetically pleasing is painting uh, the base of the tree with a mix of sand and environmentally friendly latex exterior paint. And you can apply this, you can kind of choose the color to match the tree and like I said, paint that bottom 4 feet. Generally, this is a less reliable method, and you might have to apply it, once a year or um, every now and then to make sure it's being effective. All right. Another common issue is flooding caused by blocked culverts. Um, Beavers are attracted to culverts because the sound and feel of the moving water is a strong damming stimuli for beavers. And with little effort, they can uh, plug culverts quite easily um, and create ponding. So you see in the picture there, that's a culvert that is repeatedly dug out because the beavers just keep coming back. So oftentimes you find having to come back and repeatedly clear the culverts. It's costly. It takes personnel and machinery to do so. And then oftentimes you'll also find trapping is also taking place, and this is usually a temporary solution, as other beavers will move into the habitat if they find it favorable. So what can we do? Um, There's culvert protective fences. They're also known as keystone fences. These are ideal at sites where ponding isn't necessarily going to be well tolerated. And generally they're a trapezoidal shape, as you can see there in that image. And what that does is that forces the beaver to dam further and further away from the culvert. So what the beavers will do is they'll start damming where the flows are the greatest, and that's where the fence meets the culvert. And as the fence widens in that trapezoidal shape and the beaver is damming further and further away from the inlet to the culvert, the damming stimuli decreases, so the flows decrease. Um, and what that ultimately does is it makes the damming at the culvert less desirable. And the hope is that the beavers find a better place to dam. Let's see, another common, probably actually the most common method of protecting culvert inlets is what's called a fence and pipe flow device. And beavers, in this scenario, beavers are allowed to dam on a small exclusion fence, and so that ponding is allowed to occur. And a long flexible pipe is installed through the fence, which creates a permanent leak. At the outlet end of the pipe, you set the outlet end of the pipe at the height that you want the pond to be, and this can be adjusted up or down um, again to get the pond level that's desired. The inlet end of the pond or the pond pipe flow device is about 30 feet upstream, and it's in a domed fence, and this prevents beavers from being able to hear or feel the flow of water into the pipe. Because, like I said, if they hear any flow, they're going to try and plug it. Another activity that's already been mentioned a few times is beavers building dams. They're only going to raise the height of their dam when water flows over the top. And as that dam height increases, the pond depth and area also increases. And this often leads to ponding that will encroach on human land uses and property, and causes flooding, issues. And it's not uncommon to have dams removed to restore that flow, but this is again usually a short-term solution, as the beavers will likely rebuild in the same spot and area. And if you're constantly removing that dam material, the beavers are just going to cut additional trees um, to get building material. So what can be done? We can install pond levelers. It's similar to the pipe and fence flow device, but it's used at these freestanding dams. And it's again a flexible pipe. It's installed through the dam to create a permanent leak. And that inlet is about 30 feet upstream in a domed fence to prevent beavers from detecting the flow of water into the pipe. And water flows through the pipe by gravity, where the outlet end sets the pond leveler. So as you can see, it's very similar to a fence and pipe system at a culvert. And the goal here is to limit the number of times that the water flows over the top of the dam, which is again that stimulus for them to build higher. And um, limiting the number of times that the water flows over the top of the dam leads um, um, again prevents the beavers from building higher. The pipe size doesn't necessarily need to handle large flow events like stormwater runoff, because it's okay if that water occasionally flows over the beaver dam. So the beaver control options, I guess they're out there today. You have dam removal and culvert clearing, which are generally short-term solutions and labor intensive. And trapping, it's a moderate term solution. If there's habitat that can support beavers, they'll likely be back. And then the devices that I just spoke about, the water control devices, are a longer term solution, generally 5 to 10 years. And the benefits of the flow devices, it saves time and labor. You don't have to, again, remove dams or clear culverts. They're 24/7 protection, cost effective, ends up being cheaper in the long term than repeated trapping. And they're environmentally friendly. The beavers are not killed, and the ecosystem services that the beavers provide remain intact. And generally speaking, they're pretty easy to maintain. You might have to go out a couple times a year, maybe probably in the fall before freeze up, or in the spring after all the snow melts, and you want to look for sticks that are lodged or leaves that are building up on the fence face. And so if you need help with beaver conflict, like I mentioned at the very beginning, there's the Beaver Institute. They have the Beaver Core program, and they also just have a wealth of beaver information and help. We also have Beaver Innovations. Emily and I have started a University of Minnesota startup company that will be fully launched in the coming months. If you do want to reach out to us, you can reach out to us at help@beaverinnovations.com, and we'd be more than happy to talk about your conflict or beaver related issues. And then I provide a couple additional links there that have great beaver related information. And with that, we can turn it over to questions.
There's a couple in the chat that we can maybe go through first, and then people can feel free to come off mute. Someone messaged me a couple individually. One was Emily, they were wondering where the photo of the wetland was that you shared a couple times in your presentation, just the location.
If it was the one on the very first slide that was like the nice one, that one's up in the Boundary Waters. I could find the exact lake if somebody wants to know to specifically go visit it, but I'm pretty sure it was on the Frost River Loop.
Thank you. And then they were also wondering what happens to the trapped ones.
Oh, good question. It varies. So some beavers that are trapped are used for research. And so they will go into the like Twin Cities Coyote Project or be used as wolf bait to try to understand our wolf populations and get collars on them. Some of the ones that are trapped by sort of sustainable and ethical trappers here in Minnesota, the meat will be used as much as it can, the fur will be used, the skull will be used, everything gets used. Unfortunately, quite a few nuisance beavers go to the equivalent of the dump. So there is a lot of beaver carcass disposal where it is not used and it's not sustainable. And I think that's one of the areas for improvement and collaboration we can really look into more. If an animal is going to be harvested, let's make sure it's actually harvested and not just thrown away.
Next question. Anyone know if the DNR has changed their opinion on BDA use in Minnesota?
That is a great question. I cannot speak for the DNR. However, I have been talking to a number of different management agencies and stakeholders here in Minnesota, and there is a lot of interest and momentum towards figuring out what it looks like to have BDAs as a restoration tool in Minnesota. And so this is going to be a big effort. It always is when BDAs move forward. You have to coordinate with the Army Corps, you have to coordinate with Department of Transportation, Departments of Water Resources, Department of Fish and Wildlife. Beavers are so interdisciplinary in their impacts that pretty much everybody involved in land management has a stake in this conversation. And BDAs bring back beavers and attract beavers. So I am confident that within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll have really clear guidance on BDAs in Minnesota. And right now we're in probably the most awkward and chaotic part of our growing phase in that regard.
Okay. Just want to call out a couple compliments too. Someone said bravo to this presentation, and another person said so excited to hear about the benefits of beavers in the Midwest. Do beavers like to eat buckthorn?
Beavers will cut buckthorn. It's not one of their top preferred food species. They really key in on trees and shrubs that have sugary bark. So beavers actually do eat the bark off of most of the trees that they're cutting. It's one of their primary food sources. There's a layer in between outer bark and wood called cambium. It's like candy for the beavers. And aspen, birch, cottonwood, maple, those are the sugariest, candiest trees. So as long as those are abundant, that's what they're going to go for. When we see beavers in places where their food resources and building resources are really restricted, they'll use atypical materials. When I work in wildfire scars, we see beavers cutting burnt pine trees to build with, and beavers don't like pine trees and beavers don't like burnt material, but when that's what they have, that's what they'll use. In urban areas, we see them build with traffic cones and baseballs and garbage. So buckthorn, I think most people would agree, is a step above garbage, but it's not necessarily a beaver's favorite. So they can cut it, they may use it, it's not one of their preferred.
Is the estimated beaver population in the Twin Cities and in Washington County?
I love this question because there isn't one, and it's very disappointing. We have so little knowledge about where we have beavers, how many beavers there are, if the population is growing, decreasing, staying the same. The only robust beaver monitoring that has been done in Minnesota is really out of Voyagers, where they have been monitoring their beavers carefully for a while. But we don't know anywhere really how many beavers we have. We don't have a statewide count, we don't have a nationwide count, we don't have a countywide, citywide, any kind of counts. This is one of the things my lab is working on. We do beaver monitoring and counting both through remote sensing, but then also through ground surveys. I can say with confidence, we are nowhere near our historic beaver population. We will never be near our historic beaver population. There's far too much city in the way now. But we are also nowhere near our beaver capacity. I think there's this myth that gets propagated in Minnesota and Wisconsin, especially, that we are overpopulated with beavers. And I want to emphasize that we're at 10% of the historic population, and that it feels like we are in very close proximity to beavers because we culturally spend a lot of time in our lakes and our rivers, and we see beavers fairly often, but we're nowhere near overpopulated with beavers. That is not a factual statement. If someone has heard it before, I'm not accusing anyone here on this call. I've heard that one a lot since moving back here, and I'm like, all right, well, I don't know how I feel about that.
Okay, to help know which specimen of trees to protect, what is the max size of a tree that a beaver would down? How far will beavers travel to take down a tree?
Excellent questions. Beavers are typically considered to be what's called a central place forager. So if you know where their lodge is and you know where their home pond is, they're going to be going about 30 meters away from that, or about 100 feet. And that's their heavy chewing area. Sometimes they'll go farther. Beavers have taste preferences, and we'll see beavers that are just like obsessed with aspen, and they will waddle right past a bunch of cottonwoods and maples to go get the aspen that's like 200 feet away. And they're just like people in that regards. They have their favorites. But most of that foraging activity is within pretty close distance from their home ponds. In terms of the sizes that they'll fall, it varies over the course of a year. When they're in autumn, they're really focusing on building up their dams, and they're trying to make that habitat stronger and ready to withstand winter. So they might be taking down a little bit larger diameter trees. And it's not actually because they want the trunk of the tree. They want to access the branches at the top, because then one cutting action basically gets them the equivalent of 100 small trees when that big tree comes down. That being said, it takes them time to process that tree. So it's not like they're going to take down 15 huge trees and then do 15 more the next day. They have cut enormous trees. I'm not going to lie. I go to Crosby Farm sometime in St. Paul area, and there's a tree there that you would need 3 or 4 of me to get my arms all the way around it, and beavers are currently chewing on it. I don't think they'll ever get that one down. I think what they're doing on that is sharpening their teeth, and it's not their intention to take that tree down. Otherwise, they probably would have done it by now, because they can take down really big trees. The vast majority of trees that they will cut are smaller than this in diameter. So that's my head for reference, maybe about 6 to 8 inches.
What is the size of a beaver territory? If you have a happy beaver in a place you can live with it, will that keep other beavers from moving in?
Great questions. On a stream, beaver territory is going to be 1 to 2 kilometers of stream length. So if your stream is really wiggly, that might be like 1 kilometer of actual length equals 2 kilometers of stream length. That's what they'll want to protect and defend for that one beaver family. If you're on a lake, it's about a 1/4 mile of lake shore is a beaver's territory. And that's for its whole family. And the family can be anywhere from 2 beavers up to 10 beavers. And the best defense against new beavers is resident beavers. Sometimes we think about beavers and predators and like, oh, there's not that many predators left for beavers. Beavers will kill each other over their territory readily. The #1 injury we see on beavers' tails are from other beavers that they fight with. So if you have resident beavers that are happy on your property, you will not get more and more families moving in and setting up camp. Your resident beavers will fight them away and drive them away and kill them if they have to, because they're very careful managers of their forest resources, and they do not have the ability to account for what some other rando family of beavers might be using. So they're very instinctually driven. The one exception to that is something that we have seen in places where habitat's pretty pinched, and that's a phenomenon called bachelor beavers. And so bachelor beavers is when you have a juvenile that's 2 to 3 years old, tries to go disperse and become its own beaver and set up its own family, and it fails because there's no habitat. It'll try, it'll leave, it'll spend months away, and it'll turn around and come home. And it'll set up a lodge right next to the parents' lodge. Some parents don't tolerate that and they will drive it away. And then some parents welcome them back. So another way that they're kind of like humans, when the kids come home, maybe after college and they were supposed to be starting their own life and they're not quite there yet. So we can see slightly elevated beaver densities from the bachelor beaver phenomena, but we don't ever really see like an absurd number of beavers together. You will hear accurately trappers report taking 30, 40 beavers out of a stream in a given season. That's usually when they are trapping the dispersing juveniles. So you will have beavers moving through, they get trapped, new beaver moves through, it gets trapped. And so it's not like you're trapping out one family or one sort of territory of 40 beavers, you're trapping out a beaver highway.
Next question. With beaver dam levelers slash fencing, any conflicts with other species? We have some big snapping turtles. Any conflicts? Issues for Blanding's turtles?
I can give a brief just anecdote on that and then maybe pass it to Andy for some more thoughts. I've worked with some people who've done quite a bit of pond leveling and fencing in awesome turtle habitat out west, and they've sized that fencing pretty intentionally so that little turtles can get through easily without getting trapped, and big turtles are not going to go into the fence. I think it'd be really fascinating to see if a snapping turtle could get through one of the fences, but I think that's the kind of sort of science by chance, not science by experiment, that I'll have to wait and see on. Andy, do you have more on that?
Yeah, just the gate or the opening, the mesh can be sized appropriately. Usually 4x4 or 6x6 mesh is sufficient to keep beavers out, but allow other species to pass through. There are methods where there's some animal passage device, that you can incorporate in that would allow, especially at culverts, that would allow animals to pass through kind of by going up and around because again, beavers don't necessarily want to get out of the water. So there are ways that we could incorporate animal passage.
Okay, next question. Can you provide an overview of costs for implementing a long-term beaver solution, including assessment slash install of the various methods you listed, knowing it can vary depending on size of issue?
Yeah, I can give some just like rough back of the envelopes type estimates of what I've seen in my years working in this field. Your biggest costs are upfront. So you'll be doing site assessments, you'll be sort of experimenting with the placement of things like pond levelers or fences. And your beavers may respond in the first year and build another dam right next to that pond leveler. There's ways to accommodate that, to adjust your pond leveler to now drain out both dams and things like that. But there's sort of this experimentation and installation phase that will probably depending on if it's DIY or if you're hiring a professional to do it, cost somewhere between $2,000 and $15,000 to do. But after that, once these things are installed, maintenance is super DIY. Like one of the groups I work with out west, they have like a Girl Scout troop come in and rake leaves off the pond levelers as one of their service projects, and that's part of their annual maintenance. And then the Girl Scouts get their badges, and the pond leveler gets cleaned up in the autumn and in the spring. So there's a lot of ways to make it more sustainable. Doing it yourself versus hiring a professional lowers costs, but it's hard work. You are in the pond. These are heavy, large pieces of equipment. There's pros and cons to both methods, I think. I will say that there have been a couple of good studies. I'll try to find the citations for these and pass them on in an email that did do comparisons of like the 10-year cost of pursuing dam removal and lethal trapping versus doing coex. And coexistence usually comes in somewhere between 10 and 25% of the cost of doing continuous dam removal and lethal removal. Dam removal can be extraordinarily expensive, especially with these larger dams. Andy, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that.
No, just that we're still trying to figure out costs here in Minnesota. We have estimates from elsewhere of what these things cost. So trying to figure that out here. Assessments, going to conflict sites and really figuring out what would work best would help, determine the cost of install. Um, so yeah.
All the questions we had in the chat, I believe. Yep. So thank you so much, both of you. That was fascinating. And I think everyone else was also really interested based on the number of questions. Um, so I appreciate it. Or if you're staying around for a few minutes, maybe people can send you questions if anyone else has any. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So next we will move on to our second presentation. We have Ben Mayer, wetland specialist with Bowser, who will share some updates on pertinent Wetland Conservation Act or WACA rule changes. I'll hand it over to you, Ben.
Okay, did I do that correctly? Can you see? Oh, I didn't do this though, did I? There, how's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that is a tough act to follow. I don't have any warm, fuzzy animal stories here. So, but it is a good segue because beavers are actually mentioned in the Wetland Conservation Act as a regulated activity. So it's kind of interesting. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about our regulatory environment in Minnesota when it related to wetlands. This is what I propose to cover. You'll note I will end up having a ton of slides in this, but I'm hopefully going to go through fairly quickly. This slide deck will be available, I understand. So if there's something I don't cover in great detail, either ask questions at the end or you can always refer to it later and send me comments or questions. So this is what I propose to cover in hopefully in brevity here this afternoon. We'll go through some of these kind of big high level changes that came out of the 2024 statute and some of the rule making that we're going through right now. I forgot to add in a slide about a little bit of background. I'm assuming most people that are on this call are familiar with the Wetland Conservation Act. It was legislation passed in 1991, so it's been around for 30 plus years. And what you can see though is it's gone through many changes since. One of the big rule changes was in 2009. That's actually the current rule that we're working under. If anybody has one of these around still, the old kind of, I don't even know what grayish color rule book, that's the 2009 rule. But as we know with any regulatory program with statutes, they tend to change. So we have had major statute changes, as you can see there, going back to 2011. We had another just recent major change that became effective in August 1st of 2024. Just a little bit of background. So the legislature, state legislature, recommends statute revisions. They pass that statute language. And then Bowser, being that state agency that's in charge of writing rules to either explain further certain statutes or actually write the rule that a statute comes from. So we have statutes that are literally one sentence, and then we have to write paragraphs of rule on that. Other statutes we have are the language that goes then right into rule and become effective. So like I said, most of what I'm going to talk about is those statutes that became effective in August 1st, 2024, and we'll touch on some rulemaking towards the end. This is where we are right now. We're in a rulemaking phase. So this kind of happened somewhat coincidentally. We're in the middle of a rulemaking process to update, as you saw, a lot of statutes that went back to 2011. Pandemic put some of that on pause, and then we took it up again. So technically right now we're in what's called the second preliminary draft rule. That's on our website. I'll kind of show you where that is. You can go read through that. And that also then is including some of the 2024 changes as well. Next steps for that are it gets posted to our website. Comments from the public, other agencies, our staff reviews that, addresses those comments, and then a final draft rule is reviewed by our board. Those that don't know what Board of Water and Soil Resources is, we are a state agency, but we don't have a commissioner. We have a board that runs the agency and an executive director, not a commissioner level. We're part of the executive branch. So that's how that works. And then once that's reviewed and approved, I would say kind of internally, then the notice goes to the state register. There's public comment, possible hearings, and then there's that final publication in the state register where then, like this old rule book kind of basically gets thrown out and there'll be a new rule, hopefully in 2026. Don't quote me on that, but that's kind of the timeline. Maybe another pandemic will happen or something and that'll get delayed. But that's kind of, we're on a more of a fast track now, kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel there. Those that aren't familiar with our website, I just wanted to throw that up there. This is Bowser's website. There's all kinds of resources there. But under the wetlands tab, there's information about the Wetland Conservation Act, about wetland delineation, all kinds of stuff. But the rulemaking is under that special projects. So you can go there and we have recordings on there. We have draft rule language. There's all kinds of resources. You can see there's some summaries of the 2011 through the 2024 rule changes. And you'll see there's the latest edition that you can go look at. So these are out there for public to review. And this is what we're soliciting comment from still. So these are just big picture rulemaking objectives. Clarification of the statute changes from 2024. Updating definitions to align with, that's a typo, sorry. Updating definitions to align with those statute changes. We're removing Circular 39 wetland type references. I'll go more into that in a second. There's been some addition of tribal notifications. Clarification on ag exemptions. I'll go into more detail on that. Banking and mitigation clarification on construction certification and monitoring. So you see a lot of what we do in rulemaking is actually kind of boring. But because these are state statutes, that carry the weight of law, we have to be very succinct and clear about what we're conveying to the public. And that's why you'll see a lot of when there's rule revisions happen, it's basically a lot of clarification language. There's a proposed changes to bank service areas to align with ecological zones. This has been in flux over the years. This is related to wetland mitigation. There's been issues with how the metro is treated, obviously a huge growth center and where mitigation can be located. And then working with the DNR conservation officers who are the enforcement branch of the Wetland Conservation Act, just some consistency in language again, because it is a law, we want to have consistency in language with our enforcement partners. So here we'll get into those 2024 statute changes, kind of high level again, what those mean, what was existing, what was changed, and kind of what does that mean. So one of the biggest changes is getting rid of an old U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service classification system called Circular 39. Now, it is a fairly universal, at least in the U.S., classification system. If anybody's familiar with it, it's basically divides wetland types into 1 through 8, kind of basic. But it was a common language, really, essentially since 1991 with the passage of WACA, that everybody used Circular 39. Here on the screen is basically kind of a crosswalk table between all these different classification systems that we use in Minnesota. Eggers and Reed is kind of a common language classification system when we talk about fresh meadows or hardwood swamps. That's what's really adopted by the Corps of Engineers. The Quardon is the National Wetland Inventory. So again, nationwide, you can go up and talk to any wetland scientist in another state and they'll know what you're talking about with that kind of letter system. And then what we're really, though, switching to is the HGM classification or the hydrogeomorphic classification. This is statute language right here, and you'll see a cross out and then an addition. So we're actually adding in hydrogeomorphic classification, which is a more recent updated classification system, and really lessening or doing away with Circular 39. This is essentially HGM in a nutshell. Is basically now simplifies. Think about all the wetlands statewide that you might be familiar with. We're taking those 8 classifications from Circular 39 and we're putting them into these more landscape-based regimes. And so HGM is really based on, what's on the screen there, is based on geomorphology, hydrology, where water goes, hydraulics, how water moves through the landscape, and those functions of the wetland. So we have really these 7 basic types in Minnesota. So we have our lake fringes, our river-related wetlands, like think floodplains, our sloped wetlands. So we have examples of those in Washington County, mainly along the St. Croix River. Our mineral flats, that's just recognizing it's a mineral soil. Our organic flats, so remember, think about like our peatlands. And then depressions. So again, think about like prairie potholes. So this is really the direction that our regulatory system is going to, based on all of these different scientific classifications. We've decided to kind of go this route, and this is what is going to be in statute and rule. What does that kind of look like on the landscape? This is taken out of the DNR's wetland finder. We're already classifying these systems. If you go to the DNR's wetland finder, you can pull up a simplified HGM. So basically, again, those kind of 3 big factors, where it sits on the landscape, what the water source is. So is it surface water? Is it groundwater? And then just basically the hydrodynamics of the wetland. How's it going to be used? So HGM is going to be used now for our wetland typing. So we're kind of gotten away from calling things a type 1 through 8, and we're going to go use these HGM classifications. Like I said, if you want to reference, you can look at that wetland finder on the DNR. You pull up the tab. That's the little window that has the colored boxes there, and you can, instead of NWI or Circular 39, you can click on Simplified HGM and kind of have that crosswalk of different wetlands. How also is it going to be used? There's actually an update of an assessment system in Minnesota, a functional assessment system that we partnered with Wisconsin. That's the publication of it right there. That's what it looks like. If you search Wisconsin, Minnesota Wetland Rapid Assessment, you'll find that. HGM then now is going to be used as a classification system within that functional assessment. We're also in the process working with the Corps of Engineers to update the guidance for submitting wetland delineations, where the old guidance said Circular 39. Now we're going to have requirements for the HGM and the Eggers and Reed, since it's a joint guidance with the Corps of Engineers. So this is, again, going back to the 2024 statute update. Since we're getting rid of Circular 39, we had to modify some of the language now. So 2009 rule language that we're working under right now is now superseded by the 2024 statute language. And essentially what it did as far as a definition is we're just crossing out any reference to those Circular 39 types. So if you look at what WACA regulates, we're regulating impacts to permanently and semi-permanently areas of these old Circular 39 types. We're just deleting those now. So it doesn't actually change the definition. What it does change, though, is kind of how we have to talk about it. So when we think about it, now we're talking about, well, that's not a type 3, 4, 5 wetland like illustrated on the outline there. Again, that's not the extent of the wetland boundary. That's just we're delineating where those type 3, 4, 5 wetlands are, those kind of deeper water regimes. And now we're just saying semi-permanently or permanently flooded. So it really doesn't change the definition. It just removes that Circular 39 reference. Again, we have a lot of great crosswalks to other systems. So even by deleting Circular 39, those type 3, 4, 5s, those shallow marshes, deep marshes, shallow open water, we can still lump those in because we have a crosswalk to the Eggers and Reed system that the Corps of Engineers uses. And that also crosswalks to our HGM that talks about semi-permanently and permanently flooded. So you see how a lot of these classification systems kind of overlap with each other in common languages. So it's not a huge change. We're not like, reclassifying wetlands. These classification systems have been out there. We're just kind of switching to this newer system. This is a big one. So the Wetland Conservation Act, now with the statute change, regulates deep water aquatic habitats that are non-public waters. So there was some projects that came up over the years that had basins that didn't meet the wetland definition. So it's essentially if it's greater than 8.2 feet, why is that a weird number? Because it's 2.5 meters. So if it's deeper than 2.5 meters, it's not a wetland. It's deep water aquatic habitat. But most deep water wetlands are regulated by the DNR through the public water inventory, which there's a sample on the right. The problem is if it doesn't meet the definition of a public water, 2.5 acres in the metro, greater than 10 acres in the non-metro, it didn't get captured. So there was a few of these basins out there, these deep water aquatic habitats that weren't wetlands, weren't on the public water inventory. So now we capture those. So the statute change said, now the Wetland Conservation Act can regulate impacts, basically how we regulate impacts to wetlands on these deep water aquatic habitats that are non-public waters. There's just, if anybody recognizes that, that's just a little snippet of William O'Brien State Park. So you see the St. Croix on the right, Lake Alice, and then you'll see some of the wetlands along the bluffs there. And so now those are all the HGM classification system. And so if there's something that's a deep water aquatic habitat that's not captured in that black crosshatch, Wetland Conservation Act now takes those. And this I already kind of defined. So here it is for reference. We actually have, that's a link to a guidance that we have on our website that talks about the water depth and how that's determined. So I won't go into great detail in that. The other thing that the statute change did, which did not go into effect right away on August 1st, to not confuse you. Again, some statutes go into effect immediately after passage, and some go into effect when rules are written. And this is a big change. So this is something that's not going to be addressed in this rule revision. So you're not going to see it in 2025 or 2026. But if you look at the statute, you'll see language in there that talks about streams. So kind of like, think about the Wetland Conservation Act eventually is going to be the Wetland Conservation Act, protects deep water aquatic habitats that are non-public waters, and now also covers streams that are not on the public water inventory. So kind of let that settle in for a second, because I'm still trying to get used to that. So in the new statute, it allows the the state now through the Wetland Conservation Act to regulate these streams. But that won't happen until rules are written to explain how we're going to do that. So like I said, that's down the road a ways. But what the statute directs us to is, here's the language. It allows Bowser to adopt these rules to protect and mitigate impacts to water courses. That's for future rulemaking. But what might that look like? So here's an example. If anybody's ever looked at public water inventory and looked at streams, you'll see a lot of times a solid line chases up a stream channel, and then a lot of times it'll end at a road, it'll end at a section line. Sometimes it's kind of arbitrary. You're like, well, why does it do that? Because it didn't meet the definition based on catchment area for public water anymore. So they just drew a line and stopped it. So as you'll see on here, on this example, you'll see that the stream channel, though, continues to the right side or the east in that dashed line, and eventually it kind of just peters out and goes into a wetland. So that stream channel, if it's within the wetland, is already protected, because the Wetland Conservation Act is going to protect everything inside that wetland, regardless if it's a stream or not. The chunk, though, that's missing, that really doesn't have any regulatory protection, is the part of the dash line basically where the arrow is pointing to in the wooded area, which we can assume to be upland, is not really regulated by anybody. It's not part of the DNR public water course inventory. It's not within the wetland. So who regulates that if there's impacts? So this is what the statute change was trying to get at, was now once the rules are written to explain this, the State Wetland Conservation Act will kind of fill that gap in the regulatory portion of the stream. Anybody that's familiar with Wetland Conservation Act, there's some exemptions that exist within the act. So an exemption allows impact, but essentially the reason why it's called an exemption is exempt from having to be replaced. So it's authorizing impact, does not have to be replaced. So these are typically our small impacts. I always call this our driveway kind of exemption. A lot of people want to build on an upland area, but they have to cross a wetland to get it. There's some small allowances of wetland impacts that don't need replacement. So this was a big change. So de minimis changed, where you can look at one way and look at it, kind of simplified it. So these are things that got removed. So it eliminated the threshold for wetland type in the 11 county metro area. It clarified some specifically down to kind of the project level. There was, again, some clarification in language about restrictions preventing dividing property to gain de minimis. Eliminated some like out of date language. And then these thresholds were changed. So this is kind of a big one. So this is a table I like to throw up there. Anybody that works with the Wetland Conservation Act, works with landowners, advises, landowners or applicants should kind of be familiar with these. So basically, we still have 3 different areas of the state that it's divided up. We have the less than 50%, which is kind of the southern third of the state. We have a fringe of counties that's considered a 50 to 80. And then we have kind of the northeast part of the state and the northern part of the state that's greater than 80. That's essentially greater than 80% historic wetlands remaining. So they get a big de minimis. They get over 10,000 square feet, or in statute language, it's actually the fractional acreage. But my brain doesn't work in fractional acres, so I put everything in square feet, which is what the old rule reference. So 10,000 square feet in the greater than 80 area may get you a driveway, to a lake cabin or something. And then you can see it gets less and less as we get down to our neck of the woods in the metro here. Generally speaking, we're at that 2,178 square feet. And then we still have protections and limitations for shoreland areas. So this didn't change too much. So 100 feet within that shoreland protection area, 20 square feet within the structural setback. And so that's fairly limited within these DNR public waters or these lakes areas. And then we just kind of have a generic one that covers statewide. are those permanently and semi-permanently permanent wetland areas. So again, remember, that's those old Circular 39 type 3, 4, 5 wetlands. Those deeper water regimes are limited to 400 square feet statewide. So you can make the argument that the statute change simplified things because we only have those few numbers now to remember. Got rid of metro area, got rid of kind of some different wetland types. Or you can argue, why did we, change it? But this is what the statute changed that went into effect in August did. Another one was a utilities exemption. So in a nutshell, we had a utilities exemption that had for the utility lines. So think about pipes and overhead power and things like that, that met certain requirements and had a half-acre threshold. So that was the old exemption. So the new exemption changes. There's no half-acre threshold again or anymore. And now it basically says, if your utility project gets authorized by a permit by the Corps of Engineers, you're exempt from the state rule. So one of the things that this helped eliminate or help clarify or help simplify was many of these utility projects, think pipelines, overhead power, things like that, are cross multiple jurisdictions. They cross multiple counties. It simplified it in the fact where now a utility company doesn't need to get 5, 10 different decisions from local government units. They're essentially exempt. The activity is exempt if they get an Army Corps of Engineers permit that would cover all of these. So the one thing, and that's why I have an asterisk in there, I literally had to add this, I think, a week or two ago, is there's a March 12th, 2025 core EPA memo that came out that rescinded the previous version of the waters of the US. If anybody follows this over the last 10, 15 years, all the Supreme Court cases and the definitions of water of the US, that has constantly been in flux. So we don't really know, and that's why I have a question mark there, at a state level, if limits to federal jurisdiction happen on wetlands in Minnesota, how does a utility exemption or an exemption such as this that references back to a federal program be affected? So don't ask me that question because I don't know the answer right now. But I wanted to put it up there because if you want to read more about what's going on the federal level, go ahead and look up that March 12th, 2025 core EPA memo about how they're looking at redefining the waters of the US. This is just another way to look at it. This is the language. This is the actual statute language, the first bullet there. And then just note, the statute didn't change anything with updating existing septic systems. That stayed the same. That's still under that utility exemption. Okay, so here's a big one. Here's a big one that's what's great about it is it doesn't affect a ton of the area that I cover of the state. I cover kind of the East Metro and the Northeast Metro. We don't have a ton of agriculture in this part of the state compared to some of my coworkers that cover primarily, let's say the southwest part of the state is almost all agricultural. So this is a huge deal that they've been working through in some of those parts of the state. So this is super complicated. Somebody thought that this was going to make the ag exemption simpler. I think it makes it more complicated. And I'll try to walk through it again, kind of at a high level, interest of time. I don't think we need to drill into super detail. Probably is not going to affect a ton of people in Washington County. So old language is what's on here. Basically said, if you have an ag activity, again, this isn't for your hobby farmer. This is, you have to be producing crops. Agriculture activities, we had a 6 of 10 provision that said you could essentially impact wetlands without replacement if you met some of these parameters. So now what happened is that all old language goes away as of August 1st, 2024. And now we're tying agricultural activities within the state of Minnesota through our state rule. We're tying it to a federal farm program. So it basically says impacts can happen to wetlands on ag land as long as they are labeled prior converted by the USDA NRCS. And the big thing here is that an ag producer needs to have a certified wetland determination. So now the state rule is relying on a determination from the feds through the farm program, and then the producer or the landowner must provide that in order to meet this exemption. And then there's another one there too for drainage maintenance. So the first bullet is really covering all activities, such as maybe like fill. The second bullet is really specific to drainage maintenance. So it says drainage maintenance is authorized if on these certain labeled wetlands on that certified wetland determination as provided by the landowner. So again, when it comes to drainage, we removed some language in order to incorporate some new language. So we used to have drainage language that had certain type restrictions. And it talked about if it was on incorporated areas or if it was public or private. All that goes away now. And then we also had language in there that talked about you can impact wetlands for drainage if it was, this 8 out of 10 clause. Well, we don't need to worry about that anymore because that all goes away. So now the new drainage, and this is public or private, and that's the thing that changed. We used to separate those in our ag drainage exemptions. Now it's they're lumped together, so it's private or public. So public drainage maintenance is the same. Basically says if you can do drainage maintenance if it doesn't affect wetlands that have existed for more than 25 years. It's that 25-year rule is still in there, and I can show an example of what that looks like. And it's not just type 3, 4, 5s. So that, remember, because that circular 39, those type 3, 4, that all went away. So I'm just going to briefly go through this. This is more for reference if anybody wants to go back and look at some of this, because they're somewhat text-heavy slides, but that's done for a reason, because we've used some of these in multiple presentations to ag producers, to more rural SWCDs, to really key them into these major statute changes that had to do with ag exemptions. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this unless anybody wants to know more. But basically, all this talks about is that an ag producer needs to have the certified wetland determination. They need to have these wetlands labeled to do these certain activities. And this is a key one here. It's the burden of proof is on the landowner. So in the past, farmers would have these certified wetland determinations, and they wouldn't need to necessarily share them with, let's say, a local government unit or the SWCD, because the state had their own set of rules when it came to agriculture, that 6 of 10, 8 of 10, all that. Now the burden of proof is the farmer says, hey, I'm exempt. Well, how do we know that? Well, they have to produce now their NRCS certified wetland determination to prove that the activity that they want to do meets the exemption. And another clarification, this is not a joint program with the NRCS or the USDA. These are separate. It's just now the state rule relies on a federal determination to interpret the activity on the landscape, whether it fits in with the exemption or not. And it doesn't matter if you got your certification last year or 20 years ago, as long as it's a current valid certification, you can use that. So here's some examples if people haven't seen these before. Again, I'm not breaking any laws because I'm not showing you the landowner name or really where it's located. The feds are really critical about that. So yeah, on the top of this larger sheet, you would actually see the landowner's name and the tract number and things like that. So basically, the example on the left shows PC or NW, prior converted or non-wetland. That whole area now, what is that, 68.2 acres, is all exempt from any activity if there's any wetlands within that. So that meets the new WACA exemption. There is a little 0.6W in there. So that would not be able to use this new Wetland Conservation Act exemption. So that's kind of a big scale example. And then you'll see in a zoomed in example here of the level of detail that some of these certified determinations go into with all of the different labels. And so this is what a landowner or farmer needs to supply to their local government unit to say, hey, I qualify for this exemption if I want to drain or fill these particular wetlands because of the labels that they have on them. So here's an example. And again, I won't go into great detail, but a farmer wants to put in some new tile. Again, if it's labeled PC, prior converted, and in this case, it's the whole entire field of 139 acres, that yellow outline encompasses the whole field, regardless if we can see that there's a wetland on there or not, right? Or we've been in the field and know that there's a wetland out there. Because of the label is PC, they are exempt from any activity that impacts that wetland. So they don't have to replace it. So they could drain it, they could fill it, whatever. So that fits under this new exemption. And again, it has to fit some of these criteria, right? It is on ag land. This is still the old language of WACA still in place that says this has to be for agricultural use. So, and there is a 10-year restriction still, I should mention that. So this isn't like all of a sudden people are going to start converting their land under this new exemption, and then next year or 2 years from now, you'll see a housing development there. There's still a 10-year restriction that says it must remain in agricultural use. Now, they could convert it from row crop to hay. That's not a big deal. Or they might be able to take some wet ground and convert it to some other use. But it still has to be in ag land. So just make sure you understand that. Okay, so there's some more maintenance exemptions. Again, I'm not going to go into super detail because it probably isn't going to affect a ton of land in Washington County. This is more for future reference if you want to go review some of this. So this talks about maintenance when it comes to drainage. As far as I know, working in Washington County quite a bit, there's not a ton of drainage here. There's not a lot of tile. I've seen 1 or 2 tiles. Most of what we have is ditches. Those are easy to see, but even that, there's not a lot of drainage infrastructure in Washington County compared to some other counties in the state. So again, the key here on the ag maintenance is it goes back to these particular labels that are on those certified wetland determinations provided by the NRCS. I think I have an example that actually would be better. So here's one. So if a farmer wanted to do a tile replacement and it was labeled FW, those impacts are exempt now. Again, it's the burden of the landowner to have that certified wetland determination that has that wetland labeled FW. So now a landowner can't just come in and say, well, I know I have a wetland out here. I want to do this drainage activity. if they don't have a certified wetland determination, we can't use any ag exemptions anymore, because all those 6 out of 10, 8 out of 10, all those ag exemptions went away and were replaced by tying back our ag exemptions to those certified wetland determinations. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. There's some more examples in here. I was not planning on going into great detail because they might bore you. But basically, these are all examples of activities that landowners might do that have different particular labels on them and about what you can do and can't do. So this is, tile that's within existing wetland, but then there's a W labeled wetland next door. So they can't touch that W labeled wetland. W means wetland. FW means farmed wetland. So that's the key to this is certain activities are still not allowed if they have certain labels on them. Just some more examples, and you can see why this kind of gets complicated. This is all steps that mainly my coworkers that work in the farmed parts of the state have to deal with, is going through kind of this triage of if it's this, then it's this, if it's this, then it's that. And that's kind of the key about a lot of these examples. And I just don't think we need to, for this group, go into great detail about that. So again, kind of a summary slide, significant changes to the drainage exemption, did away with the 8 out of 10, did away with the difference between private and public, and did away with the different wetland types to be eligible. So now it kind of lumps everything together, and it basically clarifies that repairs completed by public drainage authorities for public systems. So it in that case, for public drainage systems, it does simplify it because it did away with a lot of these provisions. So this is the specific drainage language. You'll see on the right side of the screen is the old statute language, and you'll see how much has been deleted. And basically, if you squint, it deletes everything out except for these two provisions, A and B. So I already mentioned the one when it comes to drainage is that kind of 25-year rule. And then the other one is part of the public drainage system. So this hasn't changed a ton. Ditch maintenance has always been a provision. As long as there's an existing ditch there, they can remove the spoil, either incorporate into the field or put it on the existing spoil pile, must be stabilized. Not much of this has changed. This is that 25-year rule example. So this hasn't changed too much. It's just doesn't matter what the wetland type is anymore. It used to be that it was only to type 3, 4, or 5s. Now it doesn't matter. It's any wetland type. So there's a ditch under the red line there. Doesn't matter, private or public. Landowner wants to come in, or ditch authority wants to come in and maintain that ditch profile. They can basically do that because they can only do it up in that blue area, because through aerial photos or previous ditch maintenance records, it's shown that probably because of lack of maintenance, that wetland has grown. But that wetland area in the yellow has been there for more than 25 years, so that must remain. And that's why you see that there's a setback now where they're not going to be allowed to do the maintenance activity so they don't drain that area that's been there for 25 years. So in that case, this is kind of just a simplification where you got rid of public and private, you got rid of wetland type, and basically it says if it's been there for 25 years or more, that remains. The rest of the area can be maintained. And that's it. So sorry that I kind of skipped over some of those complicated ag exemptions, but in the interest of time and probably going down a rabbit hole and never recovering, I didn't want to go into too much detail with this group. about some of those, but I did really want to just give you a high level of some of those major statute changes, where we are in the rule revision process, give you some references, locations on our website to go look. And again, there's my contact information. I know a lot of you on here already have that, but if you have additional questions or project specific questions that come up, I cover Washington County, so you can always contact me and ask those questions.
Thanks, Ben. That was a great overview. We have a couple questions in the chat if you have 2 minutes to answer them.
Sure, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And if other people have to jump off, feel free. We understand we're kind of at the end of our time here. Tying back to previous beaver conversation and how it relates to WACA, one barrier to landowners coexisting with beavers is that there is a fear that once wetlands are created, the landowner will no longer be able to develop or fill in the future. Are there existing WACA regulations that allow, example, the drainage rule allows to maintain if wetland is less than 25 years old, anything similar or future possibility to remove disincentive?
Yeah, actually, the easiest thing is the current rule language. It's not even under an exemption. It's actually beaver dam removal is under a no loss provision, which basically no loss provision says the activity that you're doing will not result in a loss of wetland. And it's specific in no loss that says beaver dam removal is in there. So you don't, there's no burden of proof of the landowner for 25 years. There's no burden of proof of, are some of these wetland areas, quote unquote, kind of incidental, that they've crept up into upland areas, because the beaver didn't intend, right? More like humans might intend to do something to make more wetland. The beaver isn't intending that from a regulatory standpoint. So it is already recognized in law, and that hasn't changed, that if somebody has a beaver dam, and especially in the case of when it's causing flooding, of upland area, maybe it's killing trees or damaging yards or something, there's already a provision in there that says you can remove that beaver dam. We're not going to call that a loss. So therefore it's under no loss. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
And then we have one more question. Many communities have existing land use ordinances based on wetland types, example setbacks. Will there be guidance to communities on how to translate to new wetland classifications?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the simplest one will be kind of what I was hinting at with some of those crosswalk tables. What's great already is there's like 4 really classification systems that we use in Minnesota, and I kind of highlighted those. We already have those crosswalk tables. Coincidentally, one of my coworkers is actually coming out with a guidance. He's working on a guidance right now that will help with that, because the biggest issue is the distinction and regulation between semi-permanently and permanently flooded areas of wetland, or the wetland itself. We know that most wetlands have more than one type within them, right? Some of them have a deeper water area and a fringe that's like a wet meadow. So the distinction that we're going to have is, for a lot of these regulations, like you saw with de minimis, they're going to be for, if you're in a permanently flooded area of a wetland, it's that 400 square feet. Then we don't care about anything that's outside of that, falls into those other categories, right? So that's the guidance that we're coming out with, is to distinguish those. But really, the easiest thing to do is, as we switch over to HGM, is just look at those crosswalk tables, because like I said, in Wetland Conservation Act rule land, Circular 39 goes away, but it is still referenced in a lot of places, around the country. And so it's still a classification system. And I'm not going to fault anybody if I go out and do a site visit with you 2 years from now and you say, oh, is this a type 2 wetland? Because I'll know exactly what you're talking about, because now I can walk that back to a fresh meadow And depending on where we are in the landscape, I might also call that a depressional wetland using HGM. So those crosswalk tables, are going to be really valuable, and we will develop guidance as the rule becomes, is implemented and these questions come up. So hopefully that helps.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Thank you everyone for joining, and a special thanks to our speakers. Our next water consortium will be on May 7th at 2 p.m. So hope to see you next month. Thanks all.